Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit, and I am very excited to be sharing with you this conversation that I had with my good friend and amazing astrologer, Erin Kelley. And Erin and I are going to be discussing the Malefics, which are Mars and Saturn, as well as the bad houses in this episode, which are the 6th house, the 8th house, and the 12th house in astrology. Before we get into my conversation with Erin and before I introduce Erin to you, I just want to let you know that my astrology course with Britton LaRue, who is my dear friend, my collaborator, and my first astrology teacher, is going to be starting on September 10th, 2022. And so if you are interested, we are doing a bunch of conversations that I am sharing on this podcast and that Britton will be sharing on her podcast, Moon to Moon, as well as on Instagram. So definitely follow us there and follow this conversation. Registration is not open until the last weekend of August, which is August 26th to 28th. So really, our invitation here is for you to feel into the conversation we're creating together. This idea behind a course that we are lovingly calling astrology as praxis, remembering our participation in the cosmic body. And yeah, we're going to be sharing a bunch of different conversations in a very Gemini way in different outlets. So you may be hearing a lot from us in the next month, and I hope that some of these conversations will spark your interest, will spark intrigue, and will maybe inspire you to even go down on your own rabbit hole with learning astrology. So even, obviously we would love you to come hang out with us in the course if you feel called to spend a whole year learning astrology with me and Britton. It would be such an honor for us to hold space for you. And even if you don't, there will be a lot of really fabulous conversations that I will welcome you to tune into. Okay, so let me introduce you to Erin Kelley by way of her bio. Erin Kelley is an astrologer and intuitive who loves finding beauty and joy in the most unexpected places. A former Kundalini yoga and meditation teacher, full-spectrum birth worker, and consultative strategist, she believes the book of knowledge is never truly written and has an insatiable curiosity which is continually calling her to adventure and leading her down a number of paths. Erin has studied the nature of invisible things throughout her entire life, and in 2020 she began working on the concept of slow magic, which is the practice of slowing down and stepping into sacred time, to deeply connect with nature and the land to relax, restore, and reveal the natural self. When not ensconced in enthusiastic communion and conversation with the otherworld realms, you can find Erin on the internet at slowmagic.com. So what I really appreciate about this conversation is that, first of all, it is first and foremost a conversation between two friends who are also astrologers. So you will see us really casually referring to our birth charts, talking about astrology as if it's a language that everybody knew, which is just so fabulous. And I think that you will also love the fact that Erin and I don't know. I feel like when I listen back to this conversation, there's a way in which Erin really inspires a lens through which astrology becomes a deeply embodied and felt experience. I really felt throughout this conversation, as well as, the few readings that I've received from Erin, that astrology to her is not just a concept, not just a system, but something that she lives by. I really can feel Erin's relationship with astrology because she makes it make sense in her life and in her lived experience. And in that sense, I really feel like Erin is the right person to talk about these topics, which, the malefics and the bad houses don't exactly have the best marketing out there. And so having Erin as almost like a marketing rep, in finding the gifts, in cultivating a relationship with these archetypes, with these astrological concepts, feel like a super important conversation to be had, especially because we are living in times that don't necessarily feel easy. So how do we relate to experiences, forces in life that are not necessarily easeful, while also at the same time doing so with so much compassion and humor and just, a sense of being a person who's alive with normal person concerns. All right, so without further ado, this is my conversation with Erin Kelley, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hello, Erin. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Jonathan. Thank you for having me.
I've been wanting to have you on for such a long time, and it feels like the time is right. And I want to really express to you how much I appreciate your presence in my life as a friend. And since we met at the Magician's Table, it's just been so great to watch you do your thing, to watch you grow, and to see all the fabulous work you're doing, and even to receive, sessions where you hold space for me. You're just such a grounded personality, and you bring so much insight and knowledge into this work, and so much heart. So thank you for you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I appreciate you sharing that so much. And I feel similarly like the effect that getting to know you and working with you that you've had on my life is a big part of what I've been able to bring forth into the world. And so I am delighted to be here and to be part of this journey in this container. And I look forward to all of the good stuff that's going to unfold in the future. Yeah.
Yes, me too. You. Of course. So I like to begin just by situating us in the present moment. And I'm curious what comes up for you. If I ask the question, who do you feel, sense, or know yourself to be in this present moment?
Wow. That's a great question. I really, in this moment, sense myself to be a modern human is what is coming through. And I think about astrology and magical practice, however one wants to define that, as a system for being able to hold both what is and what could be. And so really, as many labels as we can define ourselves, like at the core of it, I'm a human being just trying to vibe, just trying to exist in the world that we're living in. And that's how I would define myself this morning.
I feel that. Yes. And this piece about like what it means to be a modern human too, or a person living in modernity, is so evocative to me, because I think it brings up like the fact that we are tethered right to our context, that we are tethered to a particular way of looking at the world that has, maybe accumulated in the past few hundred years. And I think a lot of us are questioning that. A lot of us are wondering about that. A lot of us are feeling maybe a shift too into something else. So what you were saying about like astrology as really being able to bridge us into what could be feels very resonant to me, or at least that was what I was receiving from what you were sharing.
Exactly. And I, just in full transparency, the events over the last couple of years have been challenging is an understatement. And I think for all sensitive folks, and however one wants to define that, and even if you don't, even if you're someone who doesn't consider yourself particularly sensitive, I still think there's an effect on, all of the many different levels of being alive, in this moment. But I think it's really been a source of deep, questioning, like what is happening here. And if you believe in the idea that we volunteer to show up at the beach and be present at this time, I won't lie. Like there's been a few times I've reviewed my journal and I literally, the statement exists is like, I'm feeling kind of ambiguous about this assignment, if I'm honest. And like really not being able to see more than one step ahead at a time. But I agree. I feel like in the last couple of weeks in particular, that there's been an opening, if you will, where before it felt not quite as direct as I would like. And now I'm starting to sense where there is a burgeoning of new life, of new possibility. And that's really exciting.
Yay. So I would love for you to share a little bit with me and with our listeners here about your story, about how you came into astrology, and just paint a picture for us of human Erin in general. And maybe start with your rising sun and moon.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm a Libra sun, Libra moon, and a Pisces rising. And so just from that, you can probably make some assumptions about who I am that are pretty accurate, at least, always evolving in some way, in shape or form. And I am a practicing astrologer at the current moment, but astrology, as bringing that out as a offering to the world through my lens, is something that's fairly new for me. I've been studying astrology for varying degrees since 2014, but then only really focused in as being a consulting astrologer like the last 2 years. And prior to that, like I had quite a few varied interests in the occult and the metaphysical world, really always having some sort of connection to the unseen, and just being able to feel that it's there and being able to go there, having it be a source of play and imagination as a child. And then kind of got away from that. And then in my 30s, coming back to it as a source of healing and a source of unseen riches, if you will, or the treasure that might live there in processing and understanding, the trauma that happens between childhood and then, that great Saturn return. Yeah. And then I've always been somewhat of a space holder. So I have taught yoga and meditation, and I've also been a full spectrum birth doula. So, and then I think about not teaching so much astrology. I guess we're always teaching in some way, but holding space and doing counseling astrology, all of these things have the common thread of holding space for someone as they're moving through perhaps difficult or challenging circumstances, or even, celebrating the good things, the quote unquote good things.
Yeah. That walking with other people. Mm-hmm.
exactly. So that's a little bit about my story. And then I also have the flip side, which it's funny, until probably a year ago, I always thought of like the two parts of my life as separate, but I've also been a consulting strategist in the business world for over a decade and walking kind of like these two paths simultaneously and thinking about them in a compartmentalized way. But there's a lot of overlap there when you are consulting and looking at the research and data and doing an analysis for an organization and helping them. It's very similar to consulting astrology in a way.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so, yeah, so this year I've been able to see kind of how both of those threads are really weaved together, and that it's just part of what makes me who I am.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I
Yeah.
really love that because you're really walking these two worlds, or seemingly two different worlds, right? Like our minds like to create these divisions between different worlds. Like that's the corporate world, but when you really think about the nitty gritty, it's like corporations are made of people too,
Oh, 100%.
you
Yeah.
know? Yeah.
Totally. And my in school I studied psychology, and I had intentions of going on to become a social worker and getting my master's, and it just never happened. But like when you said organizations are made up of people, corporations are made up of people, that's exactly it. Like people are still central at what I'm doing, the understanding of the relationship and how one might be of service to someone else,
Yeah.
regardless of what lens it's under.
Yeah.
And that's been really neat. And then astrology in particular has been really helpful for me in being able to give context, language, and vocabulary to the unseen, and to be able to
Mm-hmm.
have those conversations with other people about the other world and be able to talk about it more directly. And that's been huge, in terms of opening up additional spaces for healing.
Yeah.
And when I talk about healing, it's not always like healing with a capital H and an exclamation point.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's these small shifts in perception that have such an impact on one's life.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. Those small shifts of perception, I feel they're so massive because over a longer period of time, they change the trajectory of your path.
they do. They really do. And I am seeing, about a year ago, maybe, we had a conversation, Jonathan, where we talked about the concept of daily acts of magic, and about,
Yes, we
and
did.
really, yeah, I was thinking about that the other day. It came back and it was reflected in someone else's work. And I was like, yes, I had just this big yes about not all of the things we do, either magically or behavior and habitual changes, need to be these big splashes. Like they can be these little tiny things that happen and build over time. And I had the concept of, how do you move a mountain?
Mm-hmm.
One rock at a time.
Yes. Exactly.
And then when it's
Exactly.
done, you get to turn around and look at how far you've come.
Yeah.
And I have such an appreciation and a love for the small and the
Mm-hmm.
seemingly imperceptible.
Uh, I'm like, my heart is just blossoming hearing you speak about that. Something that's been coming up a lot for me is this idea of how our culture always pushes us to be bigger,
Yeah.
but we never stop to consider what we're losing when we become big that we could have accomplished very effectively when we're small.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
No,
what does smallness like gift to us? Yeah.
it is. It's such a gift. And it's so precious in the way that it's always happening on some level, and to be able to stop. And I think about, you will hear this like even in like psychology and things, in the therapeutic setting. There's another mirror of a concept where it's like to celebrate the small, right? To celebrate those little things. And I remember maybe being in my 20s and being like, so what? Like, give me the big, give me the big, like, let's do this or not. Right.
Yeah.
and I didn't realize, like, yeah, the small is just so many opportunities to like plug into the feeling of gratitude and the feeling of being supported and connected and part of this world and desired.
Yeah.
It's so much richer than just the big splash,
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, and I'm sure you might, I mean, we're all humans, we all likely experience this, where you have the big, if you ever gotten something you really, really, really wanted, and it was exciting when it happened, and then it was kind of like, now what?
Exactly. That is so relatable. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think there's something in smallness or the ability to relate to smallness, right? To kind of cultivate a caring, noticing relationship with smallness that changes one's life. And it's actually instant magic. Yeah. Because you don't have to go big, right? No. You can notice those small things. Yeah.
Yeah. And what is coming through for me while you're hearing you speak is the accessibility of the small.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm curious. I feel like something that I've been noticing recently in my wide network of practitioner friends is the variety and the diversity in the ways that people show up for another people or show up in sessions, like what your offerings look like. I'm curious what that's been looking like for you recently. How have you been holding space for others in the recent 2-3 months?
Yeah, that is very exciting because really, I want to say around March of this year, some of my study at Portland School of Astrology started to coalesce and into, running into the work with the Magician's Table as well, around the concept of what beliefs and what narratives do we maybe adopt or accept based on the schools of thought and the methods that we learn through astrology, so thinking about like traditional astrology techniques and, more modern techniques like evolutionary astrology, and kind of where one might fit into the practice. And I noticed I was what I call grocery shopping. So if you imagine walking down the aisles of the different schools of thought and picking what you want, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, what's on the list today? And really, it was about trying different techniques on and seeing if I could get them to work for me or not. And if I couldn't get them to work, then maybe that's not the technique for me, or maybe there's more study that needs to happen there. And so I was kind of already in that place of trying a few different things. And I was particularly drawn to the Malefics, so that's Saturn and Mars, and they traditionally have in the binary way of thinking, a negative impact on one's chart. And yes, it can also be perceived as having a negative impact on, personal planets or any other of the benefics, Venus and Jupiter, in the chart, depending upon like where they're situated. And I started to think about the impact personally of Mars and Saturn in my own life, and how extremely beneficial it is as a Pisces rising, as a Libra sun, Libra moon, also Libra Mercury, to be able to like wield the strengths of those planets with skill, and how that actually provided a foundation for me to become even more of myself and to create even more of what I wanted in the world. And so it started to kind of flip that narrative. And I started to think about it in terms of magical practice, particularly in terms of practical magic, like magic of whether that's a shift in perception or whether that's actually manifesting something, calling something into one's life, seeing an impact in the physical world based on the changes we make in the subtle world. And started to kind of get into that and really had some cool discoveries personally for me, and started thinking about how this might play out for others. And so started doing some experimentation and found some resonance there. And the response that folks got by being able to unpack these maybe more challenging areas of one's chart was really positive and affirming. So I started to kind of continue to run with that. And then I went to Norwalk for the first time.
In 2022?
At the end of May. Yeah, in 2022. So for those listening, that's, I think, the Northwest Astrological Conference. And it's a big astrology conference here in the Northwest. And it's been going on for years and years. I want to say this was like its 28th year or something like that.
Yeah.
And I had never been before. And I was in a session and someone said, well, what if they raised a hand and had a question about the discussion and was like, well, what if it's in a bad house? And I remember thinking, bad house? Like, what is a bad house? Like, in all of my schooling, I'd never heard that put that way before. Right. And it kind of stuck with me and shook me a little bit. And so I knew if I'm having this kind of reaction to this word in particular, and the labeling of the binary, like, ooh, there's something here. And then I realized they were talking about the sixth house. And again, this is not consulting astrologers talking to clients. This is astrologers talking each other
amongst themselves.
Yeah. So I just want to highlight that there. This wasn't like a therapeutic or consulting conversation. It was more technical, but really that made me even more curious about this, quote unquote bad house, the sixth house, the house of, in traditional astrology, it's the house of ill fortune or the house of bad fate. And that stems from it being the house of servitude or the house of slavery. And that kind of just made me more excited to do it. So now fast forward, I have a couple of offerings. One is Enchanted Signatures, which is really looking at the different parts of folks, their chart, and where there might be proclivities to working with certain elements or certain planetary forces. And then also the other offering is Everyday Altar, which is around creating that small but impactful daily practice based on what is happening in the chart and what one really is wanting to bring into the world, whether that is more, like I was saying, a shift in perception or actually wanting to call something in. Yeah. So that was a really long answer.
I love that, Erin. So much came up for me. The first one being that I love, and we spoke about this before we started recording, that I love witnessing you, this really beautiful, heart-centered person, like such a softie, like going down and like hanging with the Malefics, because I think your perspective is going to be so necessary and so rich. And I got this image of Persephone actually going down into the underworld, this, it's almost like with a wide-eyed wonder, like, what are the bad houses? And I definitely want you to get into the details and the nitty-gritty of all of that, or at least how you see them and how you relate with them. But I also personally feel this something arising when you brought up this topic, because I have a very strong Saturn and Mars in my chart. I have them conjoined in Capricorn and in my fifth house. And that's not to say that they haven't brought me a lot of really interesting shenanigans.
I love the word shenanigans because, yes.
Yeah, they really have led me down a lot of misadventures, I think, but it's almost interesting because in their own very specific ways, I also notice how having them, Saturn in domicile and Mars in exaltation for me has been an experience of, it's been a lot of ego death and learning how to hold myself with, as you said, skill and foundation, which to me, skill is maybe a bit more of a Martian word and foundation being more of a Saturnian word, right? Into my life. And also direction. Like, I have seen how my Saturn Mars conjunction led me down a path, a direction where I was charging, full force, but was ultimately not really my path. And through that ego death, it opened something else up. It cracked something open in me. So I am, all day, every day, very excited about Saturn and Mars. And also my relationship with them over the years have really changed too.
Definitely. Mine as well. And I love what you were saying, especially the word foundation, because for me, I have actually very little Earth, planetary energy in Earth in my chart. And I'm more heavily weighted on the air and the fire side, and then water. And if you think about, especially all of that energy, especially air and fire, being more of that outwardly directed, like how one moves your life force into the world, without a stable foundation, it's kind of a little directionless, or it just might be some big tornado windstorm, just moving about unskillfully, creating just as much damage as it just bounds about. And it's not to say that we want to dampen the spirit, right? But it's really through the foundation, through that base structure, that I felt I was better able, more skillfully, to direct the air and the fire in my life, and also provide a container to hold the water.
Exactly.
And that has been so helpful for me personally. It's helped me in every area of my life, not just magical practice or astrology.
Yeah. So what are the Malefics? I think you touched on them a little bit. Can you speak a little bit more about how they're understood in the concept of traditional astrology and how they might be relevant for us living in 2022?
Yeah. And so traditional astrology, now I just want to be clear, I'm not like a fully baked traditional astrologer. Like, I've dabbled here and there, again, a grocery shopping analogy. But in terms of the Malefics, the root of the word mal, meaning, negative or bad, like thinking about we have so much binary thinking in our astrology language. I'm working to just be observant of how I utilize that language and working to try and come up with other ways to describe, but it's almost like a default programming that I'm still just working through. So I just want to preface that for any listeners that that's something that I don't particularly agree with, but it is, where we've come from recently. And so thinking about, traditionally having Mars and Saturn in the chart, we all have it, number one, so there's no escaping from it. But where it's situated in the chart, the particular house, like the sixth house, we'll use that for example. A lot of folks, today it's around health. It's around, I like to think of it rather than the house of servitude, like what you're in service of, and if you happen to have Saturn in the sixth, which I do, one might say that is, daily life is going to be full of strife and challenges and just a lot of difficult work. And while I have found that, to be true to some degree, it's also a springboard. Like the converse of that is that there's so much potential And there's so much that you can generate when you are focused and directed and connected to how you're bringing about what you value in the world and really being connected to that heart space. And so there's benefits to it as well. But I think, traditionally, if you had, say you had, your chart ruler, which in my case, it's Jupiter, and Jupiter was maybe squaring both Saturn and Mars, they, or conjunct between the two, right? There's this concept of being besieged. So, Jupiter in this case may not be able to fully express all of the quote unquote benefits of that planet because it's locked down or it's besieged. It's between these two that have somewhat negative effects. And if we think about like Mars, Mars, it's the, I really connect with the cutting action of Mars, so I Mars to me symbolically presents as a sword. And that's how, just thinking about the action of that, right? Mars is it wants to murder, it wants to kill, it wants to cut, right? Like it's all of those types of things, which are just, it's usually dealing with the extinguishing of life, perhaps.
Yeah. Right. So what's coming up for me is, with regards to Saturn, this idea of constriction. And also this idea of dampening, maybe a little bit, right? When you were talking about planets being besieged, there's a sense that maybe when Saturn is around, there is a thinking too in terms of, in astroherbalism, Saturn is considered cold, right?
Right.
And how it kind of zaps the life out of the party.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then with Mars, something that you mentioned about extinguishing is so interesting, right? Because what came to my mind as you were saying that was the image of a firefighter and how that act of saving a house that's currently burning, it's also extinguishing, right? So Mars, I think, is probably the planet that a lot of people who feel the world very intensely are most afraid of, myself included. I remember last year was my Mars profected year, and I was just like, oh my God, what is gonna happen? And I'm not gonna lie, like we have a huge Mars transit this upcoming fall, with Mars being in Gemini in my 10th house and then retrograde for a while, and that does bring a fair amount of anxiety just thinking about that.
100% agree. It's going through my 4th house and I'm like, am I going to remodel my home? Like, is there going to be an earthquake? Like I have all of these, like, the blessing and curse of the 8th house, right? Being able to see all possibility and wanting to like think, okay, perhaps, but thinking about, okay, how might I actively work with this energy? And so that's one component that I have found, whether it's Mars or Saturn. And also, well, I'm going to put a pin in this and I'll come back to it. We were talking about Mars being extinguishing. Mars also has that ignition, right? It's both. And that's what's really exciting. So we'll come back to the ignition part, but the, thinking about, rather than shying away from, I love this idea of, the other day I've started experimenting with dressing for the planetary days. And I just had my Mars opposition last week and I was feeling fiery and I was wearing red. And I was thinking about, someone had asked me the question of really, what does that do? What does that really do? And I had to think like, oh, for me, it seems very natural to do that now that I'm experimenting with it. But I was thinking about it. It's like, have you ever had the experience of walking down the street and on the other side of the street, you see someone that you know, and you're trying to get their attention and wave to them, but they don't see you and they just keep walking on by. And so I think sometimes the planets are trying to get our attention, right? They want to interact with us. They want to have a relationship with us. And yet we're just doing our thing, minding our business. And so, you know, I think of like wearing planetary colors or working specifically with a malefic during a transit or preparing for a transit. It's waving back. It's saying, I see you. I acknowledge that you're here. What are you coming into my, you know, field of vision right now to teach me?
Absolutely. I love that.
Yeah. And so like the clothing, that was a roundabout way of just saying, like, I think the working with the acknowledgement. So one of the things in preparation for the Mars retrograde in Gemini, I'm like, okay, maybe this is the time to, I do have a particular area of the house that I like want to redo. And I'm like, let's do this. Let's remodel the basement.
Exactly. There's this concept that is coming up for me around, what does it mean to actively participate rather than passively becoming a guest of, right?
Yeah.
Because you and I have been in a lot of conversations outside of this space about our intuition as well as our energetic body. And last night I had a conversation with someone who asked me, what is the point of, if you're releasing something from your energetic body, to then invite something else in? And I found myself really thinking about it, and it brought me to this idea that nature does not like a vacuum, right? So then when we don't fill it in with something, if we let something go and we don't consciously fill it in with something, what tends to happen is that our default mode, perhaps our unmet needs or our subconscious beliefs, run the show, right? And to me, our relationship with the malefics are similar too. When we don't consciously work with them, I mean, some of us are, for better or worse, not able to not work with them. Like when we have, in my case, having them in domicile and exaltation, I could not work with Mars and Saturn. Like they are always present in my life. But I think there are others with different chart signatures that may be able to not work with it for a while, but it does take a toll, right? Because then Saturn is always in your life, Mars is always in your life, and not bringing awareness to them is just not going to make them go away.
Oh no. And in fact, I would expect that it might get more intense. You know, that the forcing one to stop and acknowledge it.
Yeah.
And I think too, that's right. Like the perception of things that happen in our lives are happening for us in a lot of ways. And it's often in hindsight that we see how all of these events tie together. That doesn't make it easy. That doesn't make it pleasant. And you know, can be significantly awful in a lot of ways. I know people, I have people in my life, and I've had really difficult transits before, where before I had this awareness of really understanding kind of what was happening and being able to quote unquote forecast what, like we were talking about with Mars coming up, you know, like what that experience could be like, and maybe ways to work with it. Yeah. Of being completely like having the rug ripped out from your feet. And it's extremely disorienting. But ultimately those events for me personally did put me on a path to where I was supposed to be. Yeah. You know, I haven't really talked about this before, and so it might come out a bit stream of consciousness, but there's this concept of timeline jumping. I'm sure you probably heard that around, and I'm not schooled in that, but I think of like, you know, we can proactively timeline jump. And then I think when there's natural ebbs and flows to where one might move timelines. And then I think of, especially with the concept of Saturn being the timekeeper, right? When it's time to move to another timeline, it's time to move to another timeline. And that the experience of that might be very jarring and might be very difficult if you're not expecting it or actively trying to work with it, or being open to that.
Absolutely.
And being able to recognize it. And that's where the less desirable experience of the malefics may show up.
Yeah. Is there an example that comes to your mind with regards to working with Saturn and or Mars in your life or the lives of people around you or your clients that illustrate this point that actively working with them can bring a more nourishing and, if not nourishing, then solidifying or vitalizing relationship?
Yes.
Into their lives.
Yeah. So Saturn would show up for me personally. I'll use one of my examples in the manner that you had shared before, where it's constricting and extinguishing. And I felt that in conjunction, and I have Saturn in relationship to my Mars. And so that's why I use talking about both of them here. But I would suffer occasionally from, I would say, acute depression, where it was just more prevalent in terms of like me being able to access my life force and my joy in my life. And actually, one of the best pieces of advice I got from one of my teachers at Portland School of Astrology, J.P. Hawthorne, said, give your Saturn a job. Give your Saturn a job to do. And because I have Saturn in the 6th, which is our house of, daily life, it's our practice. I now think of it as the house of practical magic. Saturn is responsible for making sure I get up on time. I go to bed on time. I eat 3 meals a day. I drink plenty of water and I move my body, and it's on a schedule. And Saturn has now, I've given Saturn the authority to whatever I'm doing, whoever I'm with, if it's time to eat, if it's time to sleep, it's time to go. And I don't have to apologize. Like, I excuse myself, but letting Saturn rule the time frame of my daily activities has allowed so much magic to develop, because I'm taking care of my vessel rather than it's creating boundaries for me time block wise in my day every day, but it's also taking care of this. Jessica Dore, in her book Tarot for Change, I believe it's called, talks about we're all given a plot of earth when we're born. And that's our body. And I think about, as someone who tends to be more water, fire, and air, I don't think about the body a lot. And it's been developing this relationship to my Saturn and to honoring it and letting it manage that seemingly small, and it's not a big splashy part of my life, but it's essential. It is so important that I take care of this plot of earth and create those boundaries, because that's in between those boundaries is where life happens. It's creating the energy, it's creating the routine, and it's creating the space and the stability for all of the magic to come through.
What's coming through for me is the fact also that a lot of people who are interested in magical practices and interested in mystical practices came into those amazing practices and built their life upon it through the portal of trauma and through the portal of feeling either unsafe or unwelcome in this particular existence and incarnation. And that something as basic, it's so funny to think, right, that one could be so well versed in something like astrology or tarot and be going into the depths of existence and not be taking a shower.
Right.
But it's so common in a lot of our experiences, because I think as sensitive people, it's almost like, well, the body's going to die anyway.
Right. Yeah.
Or like it hurts, to be in the body and to have to live, to make money, to survive. It's something that is difficult.
I resonate with that so deeply, Jonathan. And as again someone with very little earth in their chart, it's been revolutionary for my ability to coexist with the body and do all of the things that I want to do. But yeah, the act of being embodied is such a rich topic, and what that experience is like. And if you haven't had that experience of moving from a more of living not really in one's body and then descending into the depths and being present, for me it changed my life. And it allowed me to have the capacity and energy to make some of these larger moves in terms of, last year I left. I was part of the Great Resignation, or the Great Reflection, as one of my friends likes to describe it, and really make some difficult choices and how I was spending my time and energy. And it was a big catalyst for that discipline. And it's funny to think of it as discipline, because really it's basic things we should always be doing anyway.
Yes.
Like, it's not rocket science, but there was such magic in it. The cumulative effect of showing up and taking care of myself in that seemingly small way has just opened doors to so many other possibilities.
Exactly. Yeah. And thinking about the sixth house too, I want to throw in here into the pool of our discussion the idea that also checking in with our intuition, right, as being something that we do on a daily basis, something that we return to multiple times a day, and how that can really make a huge difference, because often the answers are very simple. If we ask our body or the situation what it needs right now, it's like, take a nap, close your eyes for 5 minutes, right? These are not, like you said, rocket science.
Yeah, it's available and accessible. And I love what you were saying too, Jonathan, because I had the experience a couple weeks ago. I just redid my website and relaunched my offerings. And so I got
so beautiful. Your website's so beautiful.
I got kind of off kilter with the routine because it was such a big creative push that kind of happened. And I'm sure listeners and like, when you catch the flow and you ride that wave until, you're at the shore. And so I had gotten out of my routine. It was great. I was very productive and with like minimum effort because it was in that state of flow. But when I landed on the beach a few days later, I was out of my routine. And sure enough, another day, and I started having just not feeling present, not feeling as connected. And what was the common thing? Okay, well, I had probably 4 days in a row where I wasn't letting Saturn do its job. And so the effects started to show up. And within a day of 2 days of getting back into the routine, fine. I was fine.
Yeah.
And it becomes such a compass,
Yeah. I love that. I am curious if it feels good to you for us to pivot into the bad houses.
Yeah, let's do it.
So what are the bad houses, and how are they normally talked about, and how do you see them through the lens of your own practice, through the lens of your own explorations?
Yeah. And so I'll say that really the bad house concept came about from my time recently at NORWAC. Like, I'm fortunate to be surrounded by other practitioners and other teachers that don't really use that language. And so I would say, like, on a day-to-day basis, that wasn't my perception in particular. But going to NORWAC and being exposed to amazing practitioners from different schools of thought, that's kind of what opened my eyes to, okay, well, if this is kind of the history where astrology, Western astrology, came from, then throughout the world, there's likely this pervasive belief in these types of houses. And so, in particular, I'm talking about like the sixth house. And that's in traditional astrology, like the house of evil fortune. And again, it comes from like the idea that that's the house of slavery. It's the house of servitude. And I have switched again. I think of it now be the house of practical magic. And I think of it as what are you in service of?
Yeah.
That's we can choose, you know. Not if we have the privilege to, we can choose what we're in service of.
Yeah.
Then the other is the eighth house. And so the eighth house being, the house of death. It's the house of the, now we think of it, we add taxes in there, right? We add the other folks' money, other people's money and resources. But I think of also, energy. We could put that in there too, like other types of resources. And that was probably the first house that is more widely associated with magic and the occult because of the association to the unseen.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of, being a Pisces rising and Libra sun, Libra moon, Libra Mercury, I have all that in the eighth house in the whole sign system. So there was a kind of a natural curiosity about that. And so again, that's, the house of like the occult. And then there's the 12th house, which traditionally is the house of evil spirit, which again, putting things in like these good and bad, designations. I love like Stephen Forrest, who has that evolutionary astrology perspective. One of the favorite quotes that I have come to kind of hold is the 12th house is where we can connect with spirit without any borders, or that's not the exact quote, but it's something like that, where we're able to freely connect with spirit. And, I think about too, like the 12th house also has connotations of in history with institutions, right? Yeah. So we think of prisons,
mental institutions.
Mental hospitals, like those types of things. And so there's like that negative association there as well. But there's also the ability to communicate with and connect with like the unconscious, in such a way. And so I think of like isolation, and some of those themes around the opposite of being connected in community. There's this idea of being in community, but being alone or being separate and othered.
Right. Yes. You can set me straight here, but is the second house also a bad house?
In my research, I have seen occasional references to cadent houses just in general being that. And I have not particularly dug into the second house in particular, but I've also seen the third house referenced as
a bad house
in some research that I've done as well. But in terms of like my research and application of diving into it, I haven't necessarily seen that in the same way, but I think that's an excellent call out for maybe some more deeper exploration. And I would be curious to hear what you think about the second in that vein as well.
In that vein, I don't know. I mean, my understanding of the bad houses, and I haven't done like a ton of research on that usage of the word specifically, but my understanding was that these are the houses that don't have traditional aspects to the first house, right? And so there are spaces that are hidden from us. There are spaces that are not under the light. And it's very interesting to me. I'm kind of freestyling here, but it's very interesting to me coming from a culture, right? I grew up in Indonesia, and my parents were had Chinese lineage, and so growing up in Indonesia that has been colonized for hundreds of years, and so we live with the cloak of Western civilization, and underneath people do whatever.
Right.
So there's this really interesting interplay of like how colonization works outside of the global West. And I'm really making a point here. But the idea of light and dark, it doesn't mean that people in Indonesia are not, the majority of people are not afraid of the dark, because of course we've all been taught to fear the dark, right?
Yeah.
But this dichotomy between what constitutes being in the light and being in the dark is a Western invention, in my opinion.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
a cultural thing, and it kind of grew and snowballed into something else, right? So it's always very interesting to me to think about these concepts of like the good and the bad in astrology, because to me, it speaks more to how we've been thinking about it and how we've been living into that concept. And the idea of the things that we cannot see, the things that are outside of our conscious purview as being somewhat bad is very interesting and very tied to Western culture, I think, because, for example, in Taoism and in Taoist magic, there is this idea that if you are doing good, you cannot not do harm at the same time. And if you do harm, you cannot not do good at the same time.
Right.
This duality that is always present and cannot leave us.
Yeah.
And what happens if we begin to see the ways in which, or we begin to open our awareness to the ways that may show up in our everyday life? I don't know. I mean, but that's what's coming up for me. And I really don't have answers, but to me, it's interesting to think about the 6th house, the 8th house, and the 12th house. Because I don't have placements in the 8th house, but I have Venus in my 6th house, and I have my South Node in my 12th house. And the Sun, which rules Leo, because I'm a Virgo rising, my Sun is in Pisces in the 7th house. And so I always feel such a deep connection to the 12th house and to the 6th house. And I think, what is coming up for me is this idea also that Saturn is in its joy in the 12th house. Is that right?
Yeah.
In essential dignities,
Saturn,
right?
Saturn is in its joy in the 12th, and Mars is in its joy in the 6th.
In the 6th, that's right. Yes.
Oh, yes. 100%. And I love what you're saying too. And I just started reading Alice Sparkley Katz's Post-Colonial Astrology, which I literally am just through the introduction. I just picked it up yesterday, and I've had it on my list, and it felt particularly relevant as I'm moving through this path of unpacking what these houses really mean for me and how I want to use them in my practice personally and as a consulting astrologer. And number one, I'm not going to mince words. It's a very difficult book to read as a person of privilege, understanding and unpacking the complexities and the trauma and and being able to reflect my own complicitness in systems of oppression.
Yeah.
Not gonna, it is not something you just casually pick up. And so I think that's part of the reason I wanted to wait for care, being able to handle it with care. And I only bring it up now because, again, I just started it, is because they do a really wonderful job at talking about some of these concepts, Jonathan, that you were just sharing in terms of the Western interpretation of what astrology is and how it's been defined is, has a very distinct Western slant, which, it's not separate from patriarchy. It's not separate from capitalism. And this sorting and putting things into good and bad and otherwise is really distinctly part of the nexus of how it came about and came to be, and is still pervasive in the language of how we talk about things. And so it's just an interesting confluence of where I am in kind of unpacking my place within the astrological world, if you will, and how I'm seeking to create my own language and experience for some of these challenging concepts. And I can't wait to read the rest of it. And highly recommend it for anyone that is particularly interested in unpacking these concepts as well.
Yeah, I love that text. I think Alice Barkley Cat is such a trickster. And I'm not talking about that in terms as if someone can be a trickster, but I think there's a way in which their work really allows this trickster magic to come through and I think that text is challenging for so many different reasons, not just in terms of unpacking things, but, as you go deeper into the different chapters too, there's a way in which if you like to know what things are, and if you like to be like, I know Saturn, I know the sun, it's going to pull the rug from under you over and over and over again. And in that sense, it can be quite an exhausting read because you are going into it. And I think it's so interesting, right? Too, thinking about how I think I don't know if this is the human mind or if this is us, right? Trained as people, educated in the West, that likes to rest in that knowing, that likes to be like, oh yes, I can just chillax and read, right? What I already know. And then to be diverted from that or to be brought into a foreign land, it's a very interesting experience.
I 100% know what you mean. And it's similar. I consider myself in process of healing from injury by the Christian hegemony, right? As well. That's a whole nother topic for another time, likely. But it's this, I still will use biblical references and imagery because they're so pervasive and accessible, right? If I give you the concept, when I'm describing my Mars conjunct Uranus in the 9th, and I give you the image of Jesus flipping over the table, in the tax collector tent, you can get the image of what I'm saying there. But again, it's similar. I think why with Western astrology and the ability to kind of rest in this myth and in these representations of planetary deities or deities associated with planetary and the myth. Yeah, there's a comfortability there. There's an there's an inherent resonance with those stories and with those images. And so, it is quote unquote easier to rest there. And I love a good upheaval. I guess maybe that's part of having worked with Saturn and Mars a little bit more now is let's dig into that belief system and let's see what's under there. Is this mine? Is this truly mine?
Yes.
Or is it something that's placed there by overculture?
Exactly. And I think investigating even words like bad houses and really kind of getting into the weeds of it is such a potent opportunity to be disrupting the narrative, right, of what we even consider good and bad. And I'm curious if we can invite, some dreaming space a little bit. I wonder what else you have found that exists outside of the maybe commonplace way of thinking about the bad houses.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think of it as, what if they weren't bad, I guess, or quote unquote bad? Where are the gifts here? Where is there untapped potential and perspective to switch? So For me, having Saturn in the 6th in Leo, so it's not, doesn't have access there in, as someone would describe it in traditional sense, to its natural resources. And it's a bit the energy of cooling and constricting and is not, doesn't correlate with like the energy of Leo, which is like warm and fiery and, think about like, and so in having it in the 6th, like I won't mince words here. Like there's a concern that like, am I just going to one day have a heart attack? Like, because it's the house of health and Leo rules like the heart, obviously. And I've got Saturn in Leo, like, okay. But really starting to pull that thread apart and unravel this concept of, okay, I've got Saturn there, but maybe what that is an invitation to bring heart-centeredness. What is joyful and playful about having a routine every day? Where does having a routine every day invite more pleasure into my life and allow me to shine? And maybe what I need to be in service of and is devotion of is protecting my heart space through boundary. And so when I talk about like unpacking that, it really, any of this could be applied to any house in particular, but I felt drawn to, some of these aspects or descriptions of like the quote unquote dark houses or bad houses, because there just seemed like a real opportunity there. Where everyone thinks about like, oh, the first house and like, the 10th house and the 7th house. And it's like, oh, you've got Venus in the 10th, like people, you're very warm and, you leave this to create this, very inviting space and all of those great things. We can talk about that all day, but I find it much more rich and interesting to talk about, oh, wow, you've got Sun, Moon, and Mercury and Pluto all in your 8th house. What's that like? Where is which closet door have you not opened in that house yet?
Right. And it's in Libra too. I think maybe there's like a little bit of like, what's coming to me is this image of being able to do that with others, to do that in relationship, to do that in a way that is artful and beautiful. Yeah.
And that's exactly what I think. It's like, hey, you might not want to hey, let's open that door together. Let's take a peek in there together and see what we see. And we'll hold hands, or we will unpack it together. We'll clean it out. And not to clean it out because there's something wrong with it, but more just to say like, hey, we've never looked in here before. And same with the 12th. Some of my favorite readings that I have received from folks have been people that have Sun in the 12th.
Yes.
Oh man, talk about as an 8th house Sun being seen. I love being seen by a 12th house Sun.
Yes, I can attest to that. I have so many friends who have luminaries in the 12th house and teachers, and they are just the most amazing humans.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And that I think too is just a unique. So it's being able to take in everything, I think, and being able to see in the dark. Being
working
able to
with
see
the black
in
hole.
The dark. Exactly. And I really appreciate that. And there's just, and I still think that there's even more opportunity that we have yet to really tap into with looking at the houses in these ways. And I'm trying to think of another example. So for me, and transits. Oh, okay. This is another way. Cause I have my 12th house as Aquarius. I don't have any natal planets there, but Saturn's been hanging out in my 12th house
How is
for
that?
a good bit of time now. Mars and Jupiter went through there last year. And it's really helping me to organize and unpack some of the stuff that's been hanging out there, residual in my 12th house. And I say residual because there are things that I've moved through the difficulty with to some degree, but there's still perhaps lingering beliefs or lingering residue is the best word that comes to mind. It's like the trauma and the stuff that was causing me angst or trouble has been kind of moved on, but there's still a little cleanup that needs to happen.
Yeah.
It's almost like, this is a horrible analogy, but it's like the crime scene cleanup cruise, right? Like, yeah, there's a little bit more. The messy part is over, but there's some more cleanup to do. Yeah.
It's like tying up the body bag in the crime scene.
Yeah,
a little bit.
It's scrubbing the blood out of the rug.
Exactly.
It's that type of thing, and I don't like using gruesome imagery all the time, but sometimes it's what feels most appropriate to me.
Yeah.
And again, going back to like the 8th and the 12th and the 6th, being able to hold space for the gruesome parts of ourselves and acknowledge those, like there's a lot of potential for deep shadow work here as well.
Yes. And I'm thinking about allies too. Like, what are the allies that we can enlist to help us with 6th house, with 8th house, with 12th house concerns? We already talked about our favorite friends and teachers who have luminaries or benefics in the 12th house, who are just powerful space holders, always able to connect, these different realities, maybe even do some timeline jumping. For me, when you mention about how to make routine pleasurable in the 6th house, what came up is this, I am not affiliated in any way, I promise, but Cedar Hill Homestead it has this rose balm that I started using last night, and it is so delicious because I have been in the market for a lip balm that doesn't have all this crap on it, because I use it at night before I go to sleep, because my lips always get very, very dry, and it's just so beautiful and it smells amazing. Like, thinking about, bringing in allies, bringing in, like, this is made out of, let me read the ingredients: rose petals, rose hips, rose geranium, infused almond oil, rose otto oil, rosewood oil, amber oil, sandalwood chips, and I can go on, and it's just like the most gorgeous ingredients in here. And thinking about the 6th house too as being connected to small animals, and even like maybe our plant allies, right? The world around us that is that we're in collaboration with, that are small, right? That we have to get into a different level of consciousness. We have to get a little more still, a little more deep, and just ask for help.
Yes.
From that realm, which I think is connected to what you were saying about practical magic too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love so much of this. Number one, yes, thank you for reading the ingredients. I'm going to go purchase immediately, even though you're not affiliated.
I am not affiliated, but I just love this product.
We've got every single rose. I want to say concoction, but it's not a concoction. Every kind of type of rose in that, and I am as someone, Sun, Moon, Mercury, all ruled by Venus, and my Jupiter's ruled by Venus as well. I'm like, or my Jupiter is in a Venus house, I'm like, yes, please. Give me all of the rose. I also find rose to be a very soothing, comforting, protective, sensual ally as well.
While
And
also opening us up to wonder.
Yeah.
Which
There's
is not
this,
easy to do, you know?
No, like, yeah, I think of rose in mystery together. And rose is it's a symbol for me in many different things. We could probably do a whole nother series on rose just alone, which sounds really good right now. But I love this idea of like bringing in the allies. And yes, plants are such wonderful allies for any type of work. Getting connected with that. And so, yes, and like I love the idea of like of pets. It's the house, the 6 being the house of pets too. So there's all of these other connotations. I love that so much. And I really, the overwhelming sense of what hearing you speak about the allies brought to me was just, what are we in service of? You know, what are we in service for? And I think there's this, is there pleasure can we find the thread of pleasure in the difficult times?
Yeah.
Can we view it in the sense of what it's in service of, what it's bringing through? And that, to me, is just really, it's a bit kinky if you think about it, right? Like, I'm not going to, pretend that that's not a weird thing to say. Like, is there pleasure in the unraveling? Is there pleasure in the letting go? Is there pleasure in the pain of what's becoming? And in the daily practice, like for me, finding little tiny ways to infuse pleasure is extremely helpful. Part of my going to bed routine, it makes me excited to go to bed because I have this whole, like, the rose oils that may anoint my skin, the what I choose to listen to as I'm winding down. It's not unusual for it to be 9 p.m. and, my partner will lovingly ask, like, hey, do you want to watch this, episode with me? I'm like, no, I'm going to bed now because it's like, I'm looking forward to it.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to it because of the addition of the allies, like in that practice. And granted, 6 house routine, like that's honestly, not a real difficult thing in terms of like what we're talking about, but it enhances it and it adds magic to it for sure.
Yeah.
And if it brings a more full participation.
Yes, exactly. And thinking about participation brings me to the 8th house too. And perhaps we'll end, with an exploration of the 8th house of thinking about things like death or other people's inheritances or taxes, right, are not things that we like to think about.
No.
But it's almost like these are the forces that are inescapable for all of us, right? That none of us can run away from it. None of us are entangled and enmeshed. And if we are entangled and enmeshed, what else is available? How do we make that enmeshment? And how do we make our part in the enmeshment contribute to a less painful experience for everyone involved, right? Or even maybe that there is some sort of spiritual connection that can happen through that act. What's coming to my mind, interestingly enough, is my voice teacher is actually also a Pisces rising with a Libra sun in the 8th house. And there's, I think, something so powerful in this idea of going with someone into a space of exploration that only they can do for themselves, and yet you still walk with them.
Yeah.
And you affirming that I am also walking my own path, and it's not going to be the same as yours. And there's something from that I've learned from my path that can be helpful for you.
I think of it like, that's so beautifully said, Jonathan. And what I was reminded of is, if we think about the view from the 8th house and how it looks down through into the 2nd house of resources. And like you said, it's almost like just, again, opening a door to another closet.
Yes.
And perhaps being able to see from that, the sun in the 8th in particular, I think being able to shine light on and take a different viewpoint at what some resources that in the 2nd for others that they might not even fully be cognizant that they have or have the ability to tap into.
Yeah.
And, I love this also idea of, my path is not your path, is not another's path, but there is lessons to be shared. And I love this concept of doors and portals, because I find often in the folks that I read for, a lot of times I'm just cracking the door open. Yeah. And it's the choice of whether they want to walk through and do some more self-exploration. But really, oftentimes on the path of mystery, we can only see like that next right step for us. And that's part of the unfolding. It's understanding that, yeah, we might have a plan, but guess what? We're co-creating our experience and what we're bringing forth with other forces, like other parts that are like dynamic. And so it's unwritten how it might show up, and like we're writing it as we go.
Yeah.
And I just think it's such I've learned to not get a sense of anxiety from that, but a sense of beauty and wonder. So going back to like that rose analogy, it's never seeks to surprise and amaze me, but it's having the willingness to be able to, okay, can I look at this? Can I look at this part of myself and suspend judgment of it? Yeah. Or if I'm finding myself triggered and experiencing judgment of it, where did that judgment or belief that it's bad come from? And I find so beautiful. It's just a really nice paradox to live within, to hold the both and.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one other thing that I would just offer is coming back to where we started the conversation around the Malefics, is being able to ask oneself the question when encountering a challenging belief, is this continuing to serve me in any way?
Yeah. And
if not, what would it look like if I let this go or let this belief go?
Yes.
How might I create a new boundary for what this means in my life?
Absolutely. That's a mic drop right there. Thank you, Erin.
I feel like I could talk to you all day, every day, Jonathan.
Can talk to you all day, every day. And I want to be respectful of your time. So I want to bring us, gently to a close here. I would love to hear about how you would like people to find you, and any ways that people can work with you.
That's so sweet and wonderful. I would be happy to share that. I am on the internet at slowmagic.com, and slow magic is magic with a K. And I am on Instagram at slow.magic with a K.com, or not .com. I'm so used to saying that. Yeah. I'm on Instagram, basically. Is the gist of that.
I'll put all the links below and stuff. Yeah. So people can find it in the show notes.
Totally. And so I that's primarily where I'm at right now. And I, have some plans and some things for some offerings in the future, but I'm just really starting to seed those intentions right now. And so,
Yeah.
it's
I'm
just
excited for people to experience your offering. You are just such an expansive presence, and it's always such a delight to be chatting with you.
I feel the same way with you, Jonathan. You have such a reverence and a delight in terms of your work. And it's such an honor and a privilege to be in the same space with you.
Thank you, Erin. So my last question for you is, if I bring up the phrase healing the spirit, what comes up for you? What are the opportunities? What are the wonders? And what are the challenges in that phrase?
Yeah. I think of when I hear healing the spirit, I think of creating an environment where one can express its fullest expression of everything that we're here to be and experience in the world. And it's almost like a freedom. There's a very expansiveness quality to it, where thinking about the inspiration, I think about all of the things that we are, all of the multitudes, all of the multifacets of our human experience, and what a small sliver of that we're actually able to comfortably, with joy and freedom, really share with one another. And so when I think about healing the spirit, it makes me think about healing or creating containers for all of those parts to be safely expressed, even if it's within oneself, where like we might have that change in perception or be able to more fully accept where we thought we were different or not right. And being able to like fully like I think of healing the spirit is a reclaiming of those pieces of ourselves and integrating them back into the whole. And then they make a more dynamic and beautiful expression of our unique gifts and magic. And that's what comes through. And the challenge with that is that's not an easy thing. I think of the concept of singing, right? We all have this music within us, and we all might feel that burgeoning, that blossoming that wants to bloom and want to come through. But what is it that keeps us from letting that happen? And then it's working on that spot. And that's something personally like I've been working through for many years, and will continue to work on. Is that, and that might be an 8th house thing too, right? There's always this transformation, endless transformation.
Absolutely. That is such a beautiful answer. Thank you, Erin.
You're so welcome, Jonathan. Thank you so much.
All right, friends, that is my conversation with Erin. Thank you for being here with me today, and I hope that you found something helpful, something practical, something mind-opening from our conversation. And as always, if you would like to work with Erin or to connect with Erin, you can check out all of her social media links, as well as her booking links below. Her website is all on the show notes, as always. And I would really encourage you to check out Erin's work. I have really, truly enjoyed having Erin hold space for me. Erin's readings are just always so healing, honestly. Like, there's a way about Erin that perhaps you already can conclude this by just listening to this episode, that She's so grounded and so amazing. And I always feel like I got amazing insights about my chart that my nerdy astrologer brain is totally into, and also really seen as a human. So highly recommend you checking her work out. And if you found this podcast or this conversation to be inspiring, to be nourishing, to be helpful to you in some ways, I would absolutely love it if you could subscribe, rate, review this podcast. Give your favorite podcaster a little 5 stars or whatever is the highest ranking on your podcast app. And yeah, if you feel like sharing this episode, that is always very welcome. Really, my goal with this conversation series is to start a larger conversation about healing, about astrology, about various mystical modalities. And yeah, if you feel like reaching out to me, you can always find me at NateG on Instagram, or you can also email me, healingthespiritpodcast@gmail.com. Okay, until next time, I hope you take good care of yourself, and I'm sending you so much love. Thank you for listening.